for this, and some of the data from this came from a study which was submitted to FAO. We don't know what's happened to it, and we don't know if it's ever going to appear. So, but it was a global review that started off the effects of COVID, policy and programming responses on child labour, in inverted commas, though FAO did not use inverted commas, in agri-food systems. And it was led by Dr. Thorson, who is over there today, from IDS, who's kindly come along today. So she can answer any questions that I can't answer. That's the idea. And a whole team, which also included Murray Dunn over in the corner as well, from CIE. And the methodology of this was a case study, 9 case study countries, because we couldn't do the whole world. So we wanted to look in depth at certain countries. And the initial timeline was up to December 2021. So as we know, many things have happened since then, and this was part of the problem. The selection criteria, as you can see there, were a combination of incidence of COVID, but you know, the statistics were a bit scant in some places, so that's difficult. Size of the rural population, prevalence of child labour and out of school children, which we put in inverted commas because you know, definitions of child labour are very contested, rightly so, and but they are not for FAO, so we were stuck with them. Similarly, out of school children is another contested term. What do we actually mean? And again, for UN agencies, it tends to be unproblematic. So I've put those scare marks in to show, if you like, our positionality on that. These were the countries we looked at in Africa: Ethiopia, Ghana, Malawi, and Morocco. And then Latin America, Bolivia, Panama, and Peru, and South and Southeast Asia, India, 3 areas. And I have missed out Vietnam, beg your pardon. Is anybody here from any of those countries or has worked heavily in these countries that are on here? Excellent. And you're from or worked in?
India.
India.
I worked in Ethiopia.
Ethiopia. Anyone else? From, well, we'll be drawing on these as well. Sadly, I'm not actually, because I didn't look at the India data, not actually looking at India, but we are looking at the countries particularly that I am more familiar with, looking at African countries, Ethiopia in particular, and Bolivia, Panama, and Peru, where I did most of the work. So that's the data mainly we'll be drawing on, and more generally on Sub-Saharan Africa, because that's the place where most children are out of school, you know, particularly in rural areas, where the numbers are high. And what we did was a literature review, but not necessarily a conventional one. We looked at whatever was available and was coming available every week as things were changing. So we looked at agency and government websites, particularly policy documents. You know, policy documents were coming out thick and fast about what schools should be doing and what lockdown should be and what people were allowed to do. So we looked at those regularly. Similarly, research studies, we tried to look at ones that were seeing what was actually going on the ground, rather than there were an awful lot coming out of the World Bank, for example, that were making projections about what might be happening, about, you know, children who might be marrying or being forced into child labour or whatever. Not actually what was going on the ground. So we, you know, and blogs, newspaper articles as well. A lot of the data that was coming out was, when it was studies, were telephone studies or email studies, which of course immediately discounted the people who don't have connectivity, don't have phones, who were the most marginalised and the least reached by not only the policy decisions about schooling, but also policy decisions about other aspects of life. So it was, you know, and supplemented with key informant interviews. And, well, the limitations, some of which I've just touched on, you know, operating within universalised notions of child labour and education. You know, education was only schooling, so what other kinds of learning was going on were discounted. And obviously child labour, what do we mean by that, you know? If you're familiar with ILO definitions about age categories and the number of hours you're allowed to do, you know, it doesn't make much sense. But we had to operate within those constraints, and many others surveys and studies had to do the same. A rapidly evolving situation on the ground. So even when people say this is what it's like, within 1 month, it wasn't what it was like. And obviously that actually happens with data at any time, but it was magnified by the acceleration of things happening on the ground. The unprecedented situation, so projections which I'll show my cards. I'm mainly a qualitative researcher, and I'm rather sceptical of some of these surveys and regression analyses, so that's where I stand on things. So already, they're based on imprecise data, so already these large-scale pieces of information about children enrolled in school doesn't tell us if they're actually in school and if they're actually learning, if they're in a classroom, or if learning is happening. So these proxy indicators are already made more fragile by the fact that the algorithms that the likes of the World Bank were doing, well, they were based on previous years, but not previous years of pandemic. So how do you begin to make projections when you don't know? So I'll pick one example from Panama that I have here. Because they looked at dropout rates, for example, the World Bank modelled projections and estimated a 20% dropout from school due to the pandemic, which was one of the highest rates predicted for Latin America. However, in March 2022, there were almost the same number of learners enrolled in schooling. Why? Because they probably much to do with a huge scholarship they offered, where they offered a large sum, so $90 per child per term in a primary school, and $120 for a child in lower secondary, and $150 for a child in senior secondary, per child, just to be enrolled. So that's a huge amount of money. So obviously that is going to affect enrolment. So what the point I'm making here really is that these projections couldn't possibly anticipate how many governments were going to react to an unprecedented situation. So that's another reason why we wanted to look at more ethnographic and more studies, or even telephone studies, of what people themselves were saying about what they were doing. This also relates to government responses being heavily politicised. So governments were very keen to say, we're rolling out this, we're doing this, 90% have access to the internet, 63% have access to this, that and the other, have tablets, we're providing 2 million mobile phones thanks to Microsoft somewhere else. And governments were under pressure to show they were doing something, and also, because it's money related, saying how much money they were giving. So as I'm sure you found when your discussions earlier and your thoughts, there's 2 years of this going on, what governments were saying and was not necessarily what was happening on the ground, especially in remote and rural places. So the heavily politicised nature of it made government pronouncements even more suspect, I would say. And also the point I made earlier about limited research, because you had to do telephone email surveys. And many people who normally would be out in the field were drawn back by their offices to go to capital cities or go to different countries or whatever. So even key informants for interviews, much of it is key informants from their office in the central cities, not necessarily from a village in wherever. So this was a limitation, if you like, of our research, but there's a limitation of an awful lot of what's come out of investigations on COVID. So we also, because we were looking at working children, which is not the focus of this, found it was very little information on what they were actually doing other than not going to school and struggling to access remote learning. UNICEF did a lot of phone surveys in the countries that I looked at. So we knew, that they weren't accessing this, but we don't really know what they were doing other than helping out with agricultural work. The key informants, interestingly, we tried contacting 53 from 8 or 9 countries, only 8 interviews. And I think it was for a combination of reasons. People were stressed and busy doing other things. People were also, I think, some people who would have been very useful didn't want to be involved with something talking about child labour in those terms, in those FAO terms. They thought, we're involved with working children, and that's not how we want to you know, we don't want to talk about it. So they're just a couple of reasons, otherwise I don't know. So it means that what we actually have is also very limited. So let's just forward again now to 2021. This is the pronouncement from, as you can see, the World Bank, UNESCO and UNICEF. Fair point. And then later on that, this crisis, we can't disagree with it, has exacerbated existing inequalities in education. And then it says, which is why I focus on equity. I don't think any of us would disagree with that. And learning recovery is paramount as children return to school. The learning recovery is one of the things that I'm problematizing here, because it suggests certain learning has been done and has been banked, and that you're supposed to recover it. And well, I have a few issues with that, and we'll discuss them a bit later. So this is their idea of what we should be doing post-pandemic globally. This is, again, the World Bank, UNESCO, and UNICEF. Do any of you know the Rapid Learning Recovery Framework? Is anybody familiar? Oh, a bit over there. Can you do the next one?
Oh,
No.
I've just touched on it with some other colleagues.
Well, that's good, because I was unfamiliar with it until a few weeks ago myself. Anybody else know it? The Rapid? Well, you'll soon, I'm sure, have lots of exposure to it. So this is reach every child and keep them in school. Assess learning levels regularly. The implication seems to be they want formative assessment, but they want more standardised, large-scale assessments to see what has been lost in learning during the pandemic. They want to prioritise teaching the fundamentals. The fundamentals, in their view, is in particularly literacy, numeracy, and socio-emotional skills. Again, we could contest that as the fundamentals, but that's their view. Increase the efficiency of instruction, including through catch-up learning, remedial classes. I imagine in some of the countries you're from, there people are already doing remedial classes and catch-up learning. I've got a few issues with that as well, and hopefully you'll share some of your experiences. And develop psychosocial health and well-being. This was prompted particularly because of lots of, anxiety issues, gender violence, or violence all together with people being confined in small spaces. And then they haven't increased finance and investment, including in digital infrastructure and digital learning, which is also problematic, I think, when we're looking at rural children in rural places. And I've taken this here as adapted from the things in, what do they call them? I've lost the word. Brackets, that's the word. Are my words that I've taken out of the text, but the other ones are the words that they actually have in the fancy picture. So if you look at the actual document, you'll see that, but I've extracted from them the standardised and large scale. And the comment after here, after the 3 dots, that is my taking out of the conclusion that's there. So, but the rapid is the wording otherwise that they use. So let's go back to what happened during COVID, and is still happening in some places. In February this year, there were still 63 countries that were partially closed, and who knows what is actually happening on the ground. So shorter periods of school closures in Africa, Ethiopia, 5 to 7, Ghana 10, Malawi 6 to 7 months, another month later, and Morocco 7 months. These are just the official closures. They don't necessarily mean that's what was going on in the ground in particular places. In Latin America, in lots of places, and the countries I looked at, Bolivia, Panama, and Peru, were closed for over 2 years. So even when governments attempted to get people open, on the whole, parent worry about infections for their children stopped them going to school. Even when they said, yeah, it's fine, we've got sanitizers, we've got masks, we've got whatever, social distancing, outside classrooms, people didn't. But presumably, in some areas, you're all nodding over there. Yes, did you want to say something?
Just adding, because
I lived in England for a long time. I am Peruvian, so my mom settled in Peru. So the situation regarding the education and health, they were trying to, like in England, like to advise. But then when the parents of the children get sick, in Peru they don't have the resources to. So it was very difficult, like the Department of Education and the health education, both departments to agree. So the recommendation was very minimum. So
and I imagine they were probably in urban areas. So what was going on in the Amazon basin or up in the Andes, you know? And I was actually in the Amazon basin a couple of months ago, and very interesting. Not much they were not even touched by it in a certain way. They weren't even aware. They just told the government, go away, we'll use traditional medicine, and they just stopped people coming in and didn't really notice because they didn't have, they didn't have access to internet or phone or television or radio. So that actually what was going on in the rest of the world was only trickling there anyway. So, quite interesting. So learning, what was happening? Well, most people, I'm sure you were discussing, were doing multimodal remote learning. Or this was at least this was the plan. This doesn't mean to say it was happening, but governments were trying with this, particularly cell phone in rural areas, WhatsApp and other such things were being used. And some places that I looked at were printing materials. Teachers were being encouraged to print materials, or pupils were, but they didn't necessarily have the money, and then meeting up or doing some self-study. There was some provision of materials either by UNICEF, other NGOs. There was some provision of laptops, often big, but very small amounts really, and very scattered around the country. Sometimes they got free data. I mean, interestingly, in Panama, for example, the government did a deal with providers about providing free data for teachers and learners at school. But most people that were interviewed when they asked about it didn't know about it, or they had to register online on a laptop and connectivity they didn't have, and also had to spend money to get to a big urban area to try and get online to register for the free data. It didn't really work a lot of the time. Digital platforms, same thing, governments set up, which benefited urban areas but not many rural areas. And teachers didn't know how to access the materials that someone were putting there to share with, their students. But that was, covers the main modes that people were doing. But pre-existing inequalities, as the World Bank said, were exacerbated. Location, particularly rural areas, gender. A lot of girls in particular have more home caring for both the sick people and for also childcare when siblings that would have been at school were also back at the house. So disability, that particularly affected in terms of schooling. In rural areas, a lot of children with disabilities don't get to go to school. Those that do tended to be in urban areas, but they couldn't access the specialised equipment or specialised teaching, so they were disproportionately affected. Wealth, obviously, if you didn't have the money to buy your sanitizer and mask even when they opened up, you couldn't go to school. And if you couldn't afford your data or your electricity bills or batteries for the radio, so many of the modalities that were rolled out were inaccessible for reasons of finance. Even if we look at the statistics about, which I'll show you in a minute, I'll show you some statistics in a minute. The impact interacted with other shocks. So in Ethiopia, for example, there was a locust plague, there were drought, there is major conflict going on in the north of the country, where schools have been closed for much longer and children have been co-opted into the Tigrayan army. There's also conflict in other parts of Ethiopia that didn't even get a mention. Environmental, in Panama they had a hurricane that passed in early stages of COVID, so that washed out not just the schools but households. Then socio-political ongoing, this conflict in Tigray, but other conflicts. In Bolivia they had an ousted government, and there were sort of protests and riots and various things going on in the whole of the first year of the pandemic before they got new elections and a new government. So, we can't just look at COVID on its own. We have to look at it in conjunction with the other things that impacted schooling and other aspects of life. So to go back in a way to the title, which I'm trying to remember, COVID catch-up and the digital divide, let's look now at some of this digital divide. We've already said they've tried to roll out various things and they didn't really work. But specifically, the connectivity chasm is a new term that the World Bank is using. So if we look first at Ethiopia, which is a low-income country, this was prior to the pandemic. You see the difference between urban and rural. 96% electricity in urban, only 31 rural. And just because there's access, it doesn't mean it's working. Doesn't, just because 31% theoretically have access to electricity doesn't mean it's happening. Telephone subscription, 39%. Doesn't mean there's a signal, doesn't mean say that people can have data, or in my case that the phone is working, or have it turned on. And also it doesn't mean to say if you've got a family of 4 kids, that all 4 are using one phone in some cases, and particularly the main breadwinner in rural areas needed that phone if there was some work, a bit of piecework available, so they could have it. So lots of problems. Internet penetration is slow and only 20%. Now, I know that Ethiopia is one of the most affected countries in Sub-Saharan Africa in terms of connectivity and digital access, but it's, it was not good in many other places. Now, even if we look at Panama, which is quite interesting because it oscillates between an upper middle income country and a high income country because of the overall, or the aggregated wealth. But actually, 98% of state children have electricity, but the 2 largest comarcas, now comarcas are the indigenous areas, the land that is actually their land, although of course government is doing mining and also nasty illegal logging and other things. So they're a large number of most marginalised people. They only have 7% of them have access. And you look at that 7% versus 98%. So obviously when you look at national statistics, Panama doesn't look too bad for many things. But as soon as you disaggregate the different areas of disadvantage, it becomes much more pronounced. So 9 out of 10 households have at least one cell phone, which is quite a lot compared to Ethiopia and other places. But again, rural households often have larger families and there's more sharing. And I know because I spent a lot of time in Panama, that in the rainy season, a lot of time, the signal is not there. So if you want to use a phone, they have a phone, but they have to travel and spend money to get any kind of access. In Vietnam, I know we weren't going to talk about Vietnam, but for anybody who's from or knows a bit about Vietnam, there was a story of a village actually constructing a tent at the top of a mountain, and so that they could, the young kids could go up there with their mobile phones. They put a power station together so that they could try and access some learning via their WhatsApp in a tent on a mountaintop. A lot of creativity used, but an awful lot of people not reached. So, as we said. So additional challenges. Expense, as I said earlier in the example of Panama, lots of people couldn't access the little support that was available. Data, electricity bills, photocopying costs. In Bolivia, for example, UNICEF did a commissioned a study after 6 months. And because people were needing more data top-up cards, they put the price up for people selling them, who were also aware that this was an economy, they needed to get the money while they could, just put the price up. So it's already costly, and putting the price up made it even more costly. If we're looking at pedagogy, we've got a lack of cohesion across the different media. Bolivia gave up at one stage, closed everything for 6 months. They were going to try and organise some, remote learning because it wasn't working. But nowhere really was it working very well in rural areas. So many teachers themselves lack the digital devices and the technological know-how. Never mind the experience, training and support about distance education. So it's one thing to people say, oh, we just need to provide more, more access. But teaching, as we have ourselves have discovered online, is a whole different thing to teaching face-to-face. So there was a lack, they tried, bless them, someone like UNICEF, I think, trained, in inverted commas, so many teachers on online learning, rapid training. But what that meant, whether they could enact it, I would doubt it. If you do online training online when they're not used to being online, think we can imagine what the result was. Female teachers also burdened with their own children at home and also caring for sick people, as well as trying to teach online or not. There's an I missing, sorry, I hate my proofreading. Teachers face increased stress using unfamiliar methods in stressful circumstances. And from the learning perspective, they were also often in a stressful environment with lots of studies, again, mainly done by UNICEF and other people, about domestic violence, particularly against women and children, increasing during lockdown because they couldn't get out. And also because the stress of people having lost jobs, having lost income. In many of these rural areas, up to 3/4 or more people are working in informal economies. So government handouts often didn't reach it, whatever they were trying to do. So, it meant it's very stressful. So I've read various reports, I've even been to a few places and talked to people, and in our study and in all the other studies that I've read, this is the result. Very little teaching and learning in rural areas, anywhere. But almost more importantly than that is the fact that school feeding programs were halted that were very important in very poor rural areas. India in particular, massive school feeding program going on, but they did try and offset it by doing take-home rations or cash transfers. But again, whether people actually got them, it was very uneven. Health checks that are often done in schools were suspended, of course, because schools were closed. So there were health implications, nutrition implications, and in some areas, some countries reported increase in pregnancies and marriages. Now, you can make a link between schools, people not being in school, but obviously there's other issues involved, such as the drop in household income. For some families, arranging a marriage for a young girl seems a way of trying to assure her future well-being in a crisis situation when there was less money coming into the household. There have also, probably a result of coerced sexual activity, but also consensual, transactional sex. There are various reasons probably, so to just say it's because of school, I think would be a naive assumption, but there's obviously a connection between that. And children's social networks are disrupted, and that's partly why there's been, I think, the emphasis on psychosocial well-being and health, as it's termed. So, it's an ongoing situation. When we finished in May, handed this in May 2022, other things are going. The up-to-date situation they just published this month, the World Bank, is still, World Bank and UNESCO and UNICEF, is still looking at data from February. So things have already changed. So, but in many places it was lower re-enrollment, but not necessarily, as I said before, as they expected. So, for example, I'll find this here. Studies done in 2021 in Ghana, they did a phone survey, and they found that only 2% dropouts actually re-enrollments. That was more or less what it was pre-pandemic. If they're in Malawi, school dropout rates had tripled, but repetition rates had gone down, possibly because of automatic promotion. So although there's been lots of doom and gloom predicted of trillions of dollars lost in earnings and millions of teenage pregnancies and millions of this, that and the other happened, it does depend contextually, not just at a national level, but then subnational levels as well. So, overall there seems to be lower re-enrollment, but it really depends what's going on. So all of those are contextual. So there have been since then enrolment drives and incentives, sometimes done by NGOs, particularly those involved in girls' education, to get girls back into school. There have been some enrolment drives by governments, but particularly by the NGO and activity. And then, as we mentioned before, the remedial catch-up classes. And enthusiasm by some for increased use of digital technologies. But with these catch-up, you see, I don't know what your experience has been, but in Malawi, they didn't, at the time that I read this report, they weren't very popular. And it seems to me ridiculous that we've got rural kids who already have to work a lot of the time, cannot attend school regularly because they have to help with the household. We've got a situation now, post-pandemic, or still tapering pandemic, if you like, where, you know, where their labour in some way, you know, be it in the household or out earning money, is needed more than ever. So putting extra remedial classes on is asking them to attend school more. And in many rural areas, in places they haven't learned anything anyway. You know, the amount of learning that they think they're going to recover, what are they recovering? Let me give you one stat from the African Child Policy Forum report from 2020. It said 2 in 5 children leave school without being able to do simple arithmetic or read a simple sentence. Now, you know, there are many reasons for this, but if children were not learning the sorts of things, at least that people want to measure, before the pandemic, you know, what are you actually catching up? What are you recovering? Why are you making people do more hours when they've got fewer available hours because of the other commitments in the household or at work? You know, where is this recovery? And it's also got a sense of learning as kind of banking. You know, you've learned this, it's there, and we've now learned this the next year, it's there. And, you know, but the reality is that many people are leaving school not having learned a great deal, or certainly not the things that want to be measured and are said by the powers that be to be useful, the literacy, the numeracy that they always emphasise. And I'm not saying that literacy and numeracy isn't important, but there's an overemphasis in these sustainable development goals and in these, you know, the rapid road to recovery that is emphasising that at the expense of anything else, really. So it's asking extra work for overburdened learners and extra work for teachers who are also still probably doing extra things as a result of COVID. Also, I don't know whether in your countries we'll have a bit more of this in a minute. How much time have I got?
I've got another 55 minutes.
5 minutes, I'll be done. Right. So, where was I? Yes. Part of this recovery, you know, starting up with education, has also involved, in order to have social distancing, has involved kids going to schools on maybe alternate dates or morning evening shift or extra shift for extra teachers, you know, so that there are fewer pupils in the space at once and therefore less chance of transmission of COVID. So already on one hand, we've got kids actually spending less contact hours in school and then being asked to put extra ones for the extra remedial learning and catch-up classes. You know, that doesn't seem to make much sense to me. There you are, fewer contact hours, social distancing, and yet extra classes, which many kids don't have the time to do in rural areas. And then the assumptions about pre-pandemic learning, as I said, you know, that people have learned stuff to recover, learning recovery, lost learning. You know, when in many schools with endemic teacher absenteeism, endemic pupil absenteeism, and very difficult conditions, learning hadn't been going on anyway, in any meaningful way. So, and related to that, there is now a big drive by the World Bank and UNESCO and UNICEF to do mass testing to see how much of this has been lost. Well, you know, I'll go back to the digital learning. So just let's remind ourselves of I'm not saying this is every rural school, but this is not an atypical school. And there are more kids off the side of this slide, all angles. We have a guy with a stick, a load of people under a tree. You know, is this teacher going to be in a position to do mass testing of what they have lost over the pandemic? You know, given the resources that's there, no. So why is this emphasis to make teachers feel and schools and everybody, communities feel inadequate because of this drive to get people to test and see what they've lost? And you know, is this going to be, I suppose the question I'm asking is this the best way forward for schools in these sorts of situations to help improve their conditions? I'll give you another one. I've blanked out the faces a bit just to give anonymity. But again, there are more kids either way. That very small board, I was sitting in that room, I couldn't see the board. At least 2/3 of the class couldn't see the board. you know, so should they really be imposing more testing on people to see whether they've lost 0.1% of their reading capability for a sentence, when we already know that many leave school without being able to read more than one sentence? So let's go back to this lovely rapid learning recovery framework and just, you know, ask the questions really about these. You know, what do we mean? You know, how much of this is going to help? The sorts of situations that I've just described, and I'm sure some of you have described in your groups. So these are really questions that I'm asking. And the interesting thing about finance and investment is that what they've said about is that most people in most countries, in real terms, in low-income countries, have decreased or stayed the same the amount of money available for education. Giving increase in cost of living and inflation, you know, it's going to mean even less. So how are they supposed to at the same time increase the digital capacity and the training with all the extra money that implies, when money is actually either the same or shrinking in many low-income countries? So, you know, I don't know the answer, but I think we should be asking these questions and not just taking. I was going to finish, I was hoping to show you a GIF. I forgot to embed it, so I'm going to demonstrate it. It's from a World Bank blog, and when you get to it, it talks about countries in learning poverty and those that are getting out of learning poverty if they do the right catch-up measures. And it's got this great curve that goes up here, and it's got two people that kind of go and they stop if they're not doing the right things, or they go and then they're on top of the world and they've recovered their learning and they're out of learning poverty. And I thought it was wonderful because it just seemed so, you know, ridiculously simplistic. But if you can find it, and if I can find it and give it to your tutors and supervisors, you will enjoy seeing it and see what you think about, you know, is this a realistic way to tackle massive complexity? And we're going to look at a bit of complexity now. Are we ready to buzz?
Yeah.
I was going to say, sorry, my last slide, oops, which is thank you for listening to me. And these are, in the absence of an FAO report, which may or may not ever materialise for one reason or another, Mairead and I and Caroline Sitz in IDS have done a couple of things about, you know, rural education. I'm sure these things, yeah, I know some people are taking pictures. This is available, presumably, these slides after this, is that right?
On YouTube, definitely.
Right, they will be there, so you'll be able to access and get anything that you want off there. So that's some further reading for thinking about some of the issues I've touched on here. Thank you.